The late autumn wind swept through the grounds of Ashworth Manor with a mournful whisper, carrying with it the scent of dying leaves and approaching winter, and within the grand estate's eastern drawing-room, Duchess Eleanor Ashworth sat in perfect stillness beside a window that overlooked gardens, slowly surrendering their colour to the season's inexorable march toward dormancy. The fire in the hearth crackled with false cheer, its warmth unable to penetrate the cold that had settled into her bones over the past 2 years, a cold that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with the particular variety of loneliness that comes from being unseen by the one person whose gaze should matter most. Her fingers turned the wedding band on her left hand with absent, practiced movements, watching how the firelight caught in the modest sapphires set into the gold, remembering with bitter clarity the day it had been placed there by a man who had looked somewhere past her shoulder during the entire ceremony, his jaw set with grim duty, his eyes empty of anything resembling joy or even basic acknowledgement of her presence. 2 years had passed since that cold morning in the chapel, 2 years of existing as little more than a ghost in her own home, and a spectre. Her husband moved around with the careful precision of someone navigating a room in darkness, never once allowing his gaze to fall upon her face, never once truly seeing her despite sharing a surname, a home, a life that was no life at all. Duke Christopher Ashworth had perfected the art of avoidance with such thoroughness that Eleanor had begun to wonder if she had somehow become translucent, if the force of his determined blindness had actually rendered her invisible, erasing her from reality itself through sheer will and practiced indifference. She knew the servants whispered about it, about the Duke who treated his wife with less acknowledgement than he afforded the furniture, who would leave a room if she entered it, who scheduled his days with military precision to ensure their paths crossed as infrequently as possible, and when circumstance forced them into proximity, he would fix his gaze on points just beyond her, his attention carefully calibrated to miss her entirely. The marriage had been arranged, she knew, a deathbed promise extracted from a grieving son by a dying father, desperate to see his line continued, but knowing the practical origins of their union, did little to ease the profound rejection of existing beside someone who refused to acknowledge your existence. Eleanor had tried, in those early months, to bridge the chasm between them with small kindnesses, with gentle attempts at conversation, with the quiet dignity her mother had taught her was a woman's greatest weapon against adversity. But kindness required a recipient, conversation required a participant, and dignity, and she was learning, was cold comfort when weighed against the soul-deep weariness of being persistently, deliberately unseen. The ring felt heavier today than it had yesterday, its weight somehow increasing with each rotation around her finger, and for the first time since the morning it had been placed there, Eleanor allowed herself to consider what it might feel like to remove it, to slip the band from her finger and set it aside, to see what remained of herself when she stopped wearing the symbol of a marriage that existed only in name and legal document. But before our lover's fate is revealed, subscribe so you never miss a chapter of romance and scandal, and tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? Now let's begin. The memory of that wedding day 2 years prior remained crystalline in Eleanor's mind, preserved with the cruel clarity that trauma often bestows upon moments we would rather forget, and she could still recall the way morning light had filtered through the chapel's stained glass windows, painting the stone floors in colors that seemed to mock the solemnity of vows spoken without love or even basic warmth. Christopher had stood beside her at the altar with the rigid posture of a man facing execution rather than marriage, his jaw clenched so tightly she could see the muscle jumping beneath his skin, his eyes fixed on some point beyond the priest's shoulder, as if by looking anywhere. But at his bride he could deny the reality of what was happening, and when the moment came to slip the ring onto her finger, his hands had been cold and impersonal, the touch lasting no longer than absolutely necessary before he withdrew, as if her very skin burned him. She had learned later, through the whispered conversations of servants who forgot she was present, about Lady Victoria Thornbury, the luminous beauty who had captured Christopher's heart in their youth. The woman he had planned to marry before a riding accident had stolen her from the world 6 months before his father's illness, made a swift marriage alliance necessary for the preservation of the dukedom. The old duke had been practical even in dying, recognizing that his son's grief made him vulnerable. That without intervention, Christopher would retreat so far into mourning that the family line would end with him, and so he had arranged the marriage with Eleanor's father, a union that brought favorable connections and a bride of suitable breeding, a transaction completed with all the warmth of a business contract and twice the reluctance on the groom's part. Eleanor had arrived at Ashworth Manor with hope nonetheless, the naive optimism of a young woman who believed that patience and gentleness could heal even the deepest wounds, who thought that given time, her husband might see her as something more than an unwelcome replacement for his lost love. But that hope had withered with brutal efficiency when Christopher had informed her on their wedding night, his voice flat and emotionless, that she should not expect anything beyond the basic civilities their positions demanded, that he would respect her as his duchess, but she should harbor no illusions about affection or companionship. The weeks had turned to months, the months to years, and Eleanor had gradually understood with soul-crushing certainty that she had not married a man but rather a monument to grief, a living memorial to Lady Victoria, who walked through life without truly inhabiting it, and she herself had become nothing more than a ghost, haunting the periphery of a dead woman's story, forever unseen, forever secondary, forever alone despite the gold band that proclaimed her married. Now, sitting in the drawing room with that same ring turning endlessly on her finger, Eleanor felt the full weight of those 2 years pressing down upon her shoulders, the accumulated burden of 1,000 small rejections, 1,000 moments of being looked past rather than looked at, and the weariness that filled her was so profound it seemed to seep into her very bones, making even the simple act of continuing to exist in this half-life feel like an insurmountable task. The household operated on schedules as precisely choreographed as a ballet, routines designed with meticulous care to ensure the Duke and Duchess of Ashworth occupied their grand home without ever truly inhabiting the same spaces at the same moments. And Eleanor had learned through painful observation that Christopher rose before dawn each morning, taking his breakfast in his study while reviewing estate correspondence before departing for his various business appointments or rides across the property, his absence from the manor stretching through the long daylight hours until he returned well after darkness had fallen, often taking his evening meal in his chambers or the library rather than the formal dining room where propriety might demand he acknowledge his wife's existence. Eleanor had attempted conversation in those early months, intercepting him in hallways with gentle inquiries about his day or observations about the weather or the gardens, but her efforts had been met with responses so clipped and minimal that they could barely be classified as words at all, mere sounds of acknowledgement that confirmed he had heard her, without actually engaging with anything she had said, and eventually she had ceased trying, the well of hope within her running dry after being drawn upon too many times without ever being replenished. The servants moved through the manor with visible discomfort, their eyes sliding away from both Duke and Duchess when the cold dynamic between them became too painful to witness, and Eleanor had caught more than one housemaid, with tears in her eyes, after observing Christopher walk past his wife in a corridor as if she were merely another piece of architecture, his gaze fixed determinedly ahead, his posture radiating such deliberate obliviousness that it seemed almost a physical force pushing Eleanor aside. She had found purpose, or at least distraction, in charity work among the village families, visiting the sick and elderly, organizing aid for those struggling through harsh seasons, and these hours spent among people who actually saw her, who greeted her with warmth and gratitude, became the only moments when she felt real, when the weight of invisibility lifted enough for her to remember what it felt like to exist in the world as something more than a shadow. This particular evening had been especially difficult, a formal dinner where custom demanded they both be present, and Eleanor had sat at one end of the long matable while Christopher occupied the other, the distance between them filled with silver and crystal and the elaborate meal neither of them had appetite for, and throughout the entire hour, Christopher had read from a leather-bound volume propped beside his plate, his attention absorbed so completely by the printed words that he had not spoken a single syllable, had not even glanced in her direction when she had quietly asked him to pass the salt, forcing a footman to intervene and complete the simple gesture of marital consideration that her husband could not be bothered to perform. Now, back in the drawing room with the fire burning low and the autumn wind rattling the windows, Eleanor turned the wedding ring on her finger one more time, feeling the smooth metal slide against her skin, and something shifted in her chest, a resolution crystallizing from the murky waters of her despair, a clarity born from the simple recognition that 2 years of patience had purchased her nothing but further loneliness, and she knew with sudden certainty that she could not continue living this half-life, could not keep wearing the symbol of vows that only she honored, could not remain invisible in her own existence, simply because the man who had promised to cherish her had chosen instead to pretend she did not exist. The crisis arrived on a rain-swept evening in late October, when Eleanor found herself walking past Christopher's chamber on her way to her own rooms, and heard through the partially open door the sound of his voice speaking in sleep, the words indistinct at first, but growing clearer as she paused despite herself. And then she heard it, clear as cathedral bells in the quiet hallway. "Victoria, please don't leave me," spoken with such raw anguish that it seemed to tear from somewhere deep within him, a pain so profound that even unconsciousness could not contain it, and Eleanor stood frozen in the corridor as the truth she had known intellectually crashed into her with visceral force. The understanding that 2 years of patience and dignity and quiet hope had changed absolutely nothing, that she was no closer to being seen by her husband now than she had been on their wedding day, that she would always and forever be competing with a ghost she could never hope to displace, because the dead remain perfect in memory, while the living accumulate flaws with every breath. She retreated to her chambers with legs that trembled beneath her skirts, dismissing her lady's maid with a voice that came out steadier than she felt, and sat at her vanity, staring at her own reflection as if seeing a stranger. This woman who had allowed herself to become invisible, who had accepted crumbs of basic civility and called it marriage, who had worn the symbol of vows that meant nothing to the man who had spoken them, and the ring on her finger suddenly felt unbearably heavy, a shackle rather than an adornment, a lie she had been complicit in telling to the world and to herself. The next morning, her maid Margaret found her red-eyed and hollow, and with the perceptiveness that came from years of service, the older woman had set down the breakfast tray and asked gently if her grace wished to talk, and Eleanor, so starved for genuine human connection that even this small offer of understanding broke through her careful composure, had told her everything, the words spilling out in a rush about the wedding night's rejection, the 2 years of being looked past, the name spoken in sleep that confirmed what she had always suspected, and Margaret had listened with an expression that moved from sympathy to indignation, finally saying in her forthright way, "Begging your pardon, Your Grace, but a woman's got to have some dignity, and there's no dignity in wearing the ring of a man who won't even do you the courtesy of looking at you. Ghost or no ghost, grief or no grief, a body's got to respect herself if nobody else will." The words had struck Eleanor like a physical blow, not because they were harsh, but because they were true, because they gave voice to the knowledge that had been growing in her heart like a dark flower, the recognition that continuing as she had been was not patience or virtue, but rather a slow form of self-erasure, a willing participation in her own diminishment, and she had looked down at her wedding ring with new eyes, seeing it not as a symbol of hope or commitment, but as evidence of her complicity in accepting the unacceptable, in allowing herself to become less than whole, because a man who had never chosen her was too trapped in grief to see what he was doing to another human soul. That night, Eleanor lay awake in her bed, listening to the rain against the windows and conducting a brutal inventory of her life, acknowledging that she had become a shadow in her own existence, that she moved through the manor like a ghost herself, that she had learned to make herself small and quiet and unobtrusive in the hope that by demanding nothing she might eventually be granted something, but 2 years had taught her that self-abnegation purchased nothing but further neglect, that Christopher would never wake from his grief-induced stupor if she continued enabling him to ignore reality, and more importantly, that she deserved better than this half-life regardless of whether he ever changed or not. The decision crystallized in the darkest hours before dawn, settling into her bones with a finality that felt like both grief and relief, and she knew with absolute certainty that when morning came, she would remove the wedding ring, not as an act of rebellion or revenge, but as a simple reclamation of her own dignity, an acknowledgement that she could not control Christopher's healing or his choices, but she could control her own participation in a fiction that was slowly killing her spirit. And with this resolution came a strange peace, the calm that arrives when a long-delayed decision is finally made, and the agony of indecision gives way to the clarity of action. She rose with the sun's first light, her last hope whispering that perhaps today would be different. Perhaps Christopher would emerge from his chambers and actually see her. Perhaps some miracle would occur to make the ring's removal unnecessary. But when she descended to breakfast and found him already gone, his place at the table cleared and cold, of the household operating on its usual schedule of careful separation, that final, fragile hope shattered like frost beneath a boot, and Eleanor returned to her chambers, sat at her vanity, and stared at the gold band that had become a symbol of everything she needed to release if she was ever to find herself again. The morning arrived with pale November light filtering through the windows of Eleanor's chambers, and she sat at her vanity with her heart beating so heavily she could feel it in her throat, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for the wedding ring that had circled her finger for 2 years, and the act of sliding it off was both simpler and more momentous than she had imagined. The gold band slipping over her knuckle with barely any resistance, as if it too recognized that it no longer belonged there, and when she set it on the polished wood surface before her, the small metallic sound it made seemed impossibly loud in the quiet room, final as a judge's gavel. Her finger looked strange and pale, the skin beneath where the ring had rested a shade lighter than the rest of her hand, a band of untouched flesh that marked where the symbol of her marriage had been, and Eleanor stared at this mark with feelings that tangled into a knot she could not fully unravel. Liberation and grief twisted together so tightly that she could not separate one from the other, freedom and loss, occupying the same space in her chest until she thought she might shatter from the pressure of containing both. She picked up the ring again, holding it to the morning light, watching the way the gold caught and reflected the pale sun, and for a moment she considered putting it back on, reconsidering this gesture that felt both necessary and terrifying. But then she thought of Christopher speaking Victoria's name in his sleep, of 2 years spent being invisible in her own home, of the slow erosion of her spirit that came from accepting the unacceptable, and her resolve hardened like steel, tempered in fire. Eleanor opened her jewelry box, the one she had brought from her family home, lined with blue velvet and containing the modest collection of pieces she had inherited from her mother, and she placed the wedding ring inside, not hidden but not discarded either, an acknowledgement that she was not destroying her marriage, but rather refusing to pretend it existed in any meaningful form until Christopher chose to make it real. The act felt ceremonial, a private ritual marking the end of one chapter and the uncertain beginning of another. And when she closed the box, she felt something shift in her chest, a lightness that came from setting down a burden she had carried for far too long, the exhausting weight of hope that had curdled into something bitter and heavy. She dressed with Margaret's help, choosing a gown of deep emerald that she had not worn before, a color brighter than the muted grays and browns she had favored in recent months. And when the maid noticed the bare finger, she said nothing, but Eleanor caught the small nod of approval, the slight softening around the older woman's eyes that communicated understanding and support. Christopher had already departed for his morning ride when Eleanor descended to breakfast, the household operating on its usual schedule of careful separation, and she took her seat at the table with her hands resting on the white tablecloth, her bare left hand visible to anyone who cared to look, and she felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with propriety and everything to do with vulnerability, as if she had removed armor she had not even realized she was wearing. The footman poured her tea with the same deference as always, his eyes flickering to her hand and then quickly away, and Eleanor lifted her cup with fingers that no longer trembled, feeling the strange lightness of her hand without the ring's familiar weight, and she thought to herself, with a clarity that surprised her, "I will learn to live for myself now, whatever that means, whatever it costs. I will remember that I am a person who exists whether Christopher Ashworth chooses to see me or not." And with this thought came a sense of purpose she had not felt in 2 long years, a determination to reclaim the parts of herself she had allowed to wither in the cold shadow of her husband's grief. The days that followed Eleanor's removal of the wedding ring unfurled with a strange mixture of trepidation and expanding possibility, as if she had opened a window in a room that had been sealed for too long, and was only now beginning to feel fresh air move through spaces that had grown stale with disuse. The first change came when Lady Pemberton's invitation arrived for a small afternoon gathering, the sort of social engagement Eleanor had declined with increasing frequency over the past 2 years, her excuses growing thinner as her isolation deepened. but now she found herself penning an acceptance with a hand that felt steadier than it had in months. The simple act of agreeing to attend a tea party, seeming like a small revolution against the circumscribed existence she had allowed to become her prison. She summoned the dressmaker to her chambers, a woman who had made her mourning-adjacent wardrobe of greys and subdued browns, and requested new gowns in colors that had seemed too bold, too alive for the ghost wife she had been. Rich burgundies and deep sapphires and emerald greens that would mark her as a woman who existed in the present rather than one who had faded into the manor's shadows. And when the dressmaker's eyes flickered to her bare ring finger, Eleanor met her gaze with a calm that surprised them both, offering no explanation because she owed none. Her chambers became the next frontier of transformation, as Eleanor instructed the household staff to remove the heavy damask curtains that had made the rooms feel like a tomb even in daylight, replacing them with lighter fabrics that allowed the November sun to illuminate corners that had been perpetually dim. And she brought in flowers from the conservatory, bright chrysanthemums and late-blooming roses that added color and life to spaces that had reflected her own withering spirit. And each small change felt like an act of reclamation, a taking back of territory she had ceded without even realizing she was surrendering. The household staff navigated these changes with the careful discretion that came from years of service in great houses, their eyes noting the absent ring and the transformed chambers, and the Duchess, who seemed to stand taller, speak more clearly, move through the manor with purpose rather than the tentative half-presence that had characterized her existence for 2 long years. And though they said nothing directly, Eleanor felt their subtle support in the efficiency with which her requests were carried out, in Margaret's approving nods, in the way the footmen seemed to look at her rather than past her, as they had learned to do in imitation of their master. She attended Lady Pemberton's gathering wearing a gown of deep blue that made her eyes seem larger and brighter, and found herself actually enjoying the company of women she had held at arm's length, their conversation about books and charity work, and the small dramas of their social circle, feeling like nourishment after years of starvation. And when Lady Hartley asked after the Duke with the careful politeness that people used when discussing difficult subjects, Eleanor answered with a composure that came from having finally accepted the truth of her situation, saying simply that His Grace remained devoted to his estate business, the words neither a lie nor an elaboration of fiction. Meanwhile, Christopher maintained his usual patterns as if the world had not shifted beneath his feet, departing each morning for his rides and estate inspections, spending his afternoons in his study with account books and correspondence, taking his dinners either alone or in the company of business associates who required his attention, and if he noticed any change in the household's atmosphere, he gave no sign of it, his carefully constructed routines insulating him from awareness, the way armor protects a soldier from blows that never quite land. A week passed, then another, and the wedding ring remained in Eleanor's jewelry box, gathering the fine dust of disuse. And with each day that she did not wear it, Eleanor felt herself becoming more solid, more real, as if the ring had been anchoring her to a fiction, and its absence allowed her to inhabit her own life, with an authenticity she had not known was missing until she found it again. Christopher Ashworth had lived for 2 years in a carefully constructed world of his own making, an existence built on routine and deliberate blindness that allowed him to move through his days without the disruption of acknowledging his wife's presence. But in the 3rd week of November, something began to shift in the foundations of this edifice he had built. Small tremors he could not quite identify that left him with a persistent unease he had no name for and could not trace to any particular source. It began as the vaguest sensation, a feeling that something in the manor's atmosphere had changed in ways he could not articulate, as if the very air moved differently through rooms he had walked through countless times before, and he found himself pausing in doorways with a frown creasing his brow, listening to sounds he could not quite place, trying to identify what felt altered in a house that should have been as familiar to him as his own reflection. The sound of Eleanor's laughter drifting from the morning room one afternoon stopped him in the corridor outside his study, the bright, genuine quality of it so unexpected that for a moment he stood frozen, his hand on the door handle, listening to a sound he could not remember ever hearing before, or perhaps had heard and trained himself not to notice, and something in his chest tightened with an emotion he refused to examine too closely before he shook his head and entered his study, closing the door firmly against the disturbance. At dinner that evening, He found himself glancing toward Eleanor's end of the table more frequently than usual, his eyes tracking the movement of her hands as she gestured while speaking to the footman about the next day's menu. And though he still kept his gaze carefully averted from her face, he noticed details that seemed to penetrate his usual fog of deliberate inattention. The deep blue of her gown, a color he did not remember her wearing before, the way she held herself with a straightness in her spine that suggested confidence rather than the defeated slump he had peripherally observed in previous months. His sleep became restless in ways that had nothing to do with his usual dreams of Victoria, his mind churning with half-formed thoughts that dissolved when he tried to examine them directly, leaving him to wake in the dark, hours before dawn, with his heart beating too quickly and a sense that something important was escaping his notice, slipping past his defenses while he slept, and he would lie staring at the canopy of his bed, wondering what had changed and why it should matter to him when he had worked so hard to ensure that nothing about his domestic situation could touch him. His secretary, Mr. Harrison, made an observation during their morning review of estate correspondence that lingered in Christopher's mind long after it should have been dismissed and forgotten, mentioning in passing that the Duchess seemed in remarkably good spirits lately, quite transformed from her previous melancholy, and Christopher had responded with a non-committal sound that discouraged further discussion, but the words echoed in his thoughts throughout the day, raising questions he did not want to answer about what might have caused such a transformation and why he had not noticed it himself. That evening at dinner, Christopher experienced something unprecedented in 2 years of careful avoidance. He almost looked at Eleanor's face, his eyes traveling up from the table toward where she sat, drawn by some impulse he could not control, and at the last moment he caught himself and redirected his gaze to the window beyond her shoulder. But in that fraction of a second before he looked away, he had seen the pale column of her throat, the curve of her jaw, the dark sweep of her hair, and the glimpse left him strangely unsettled, as if he had touched something forbidden and found it burned in ways he had not expected. And for the rest of the meal he kept his eyes fixed firmly on his plate, disturbed by his own near transgression and the way his careful defenses had almost crumbled. Eleanor discovered the painting supplies in the back of a storage room 3 weeks after removing her wedding ring, the wooden box covered in a fine layer of dust that spoke of years of neglect, and when she opened it, the smell of linseed oil and pigment transported her instantly to her girlhood, when she had spent hours capturing the world in brushstrokes, a passion her mother had encouraged, as suitable for a young lady of quality, though Eleanor had loved it for reasons that had nothing to do with suitability and everything to do with the way it made her feel alive and present in each moment of creation. She had the box carried to the small sitting room adjacent to her bedchamber, the one with northern light that would serve perfectly as a makeshift studio, and when she mixed her first palette in 2 years, her hands trembled not with uncertainty, but with the recognition of coming home to something essential she had abandoned in the slow erosion of her sense of self that marriage had wrought. The painting became a daily ritual, a way of reclaiming hours that had previously been filled with the hollow activities of a woman waiting for a life that would never begin, and as she worked, Eleanor felt layers of accumulated sorrow and resignation beginning to lift. Each brushstroke, an act of assertion that she existed, that she mattered, that she contained depths and desires that had nothing to do with the man who refused to see her. It was during one of Lady Pemberton's gatherings that Eleanor met Lady Margaret Whitmore, a widow of independent means whose frank conversation and sharp wit cut through the usual superficiality of social discourse, and when Margaret mentioned that she was hosting a salon for ladies interested in discussing literature and philosophy, Eleanor accepted the invitation with an eagerness that would have surprised her former self, the woman who had retreated from society rather than face pitying looks and careful questions about her marriage. The salon met weekly in Margaret's elegant townhouse, and Eleanor found herself among women who spoke of ideas and ambitions, who discussed books with passionate intensity, who seemed to live full lives despite or perhaps because of their various disappointments with the institution of marriage, and in their company, Eleanor felt her mind awakening from the numbness that had settled over it, like frost over a garden. Margaret became something unexpected in Eleanor's carefully circumscribed existence, a true friend, someone who asked direct questions and expected honest answers, who listened to Eleanor's halting admissions about her marriage with neither judgment nor false comfort, but rather with the understanding of someone who had survived her own trials and emerged with her dignity intact. They spoke of resilience, of finding purpose beyond the confines others had drawn around their lives, of the quiet courage required to choose oneself when society insisted that a woman's entire existence should be defined by her relationship to a man, and these conversations planted seeds in Eleanor's consciousness that took root and flourished in the fertile ground of her newfound autonomy. One afternoon, while painting, Eleanor realized with a start that she had been working for 3 hours without a single thought of Christopher entering her mind, and this discovery brought a mixture of liberation and melancholy. The recognition that she was finally beginning to exist independently of the emotional weight that had pressed down on her for 2 long years. Her chambers had become a sanctuary entirely of her own creation, filled with her paintings and books, flowers she had chosen, colors that pleased her eye, a space that reflected her emerging sense of self rather than the role she had tried so hard and so unsuccessfully to inhabit. And when she sat at her writing desk in the evenings, she began composing long letters to her sister Catherine, pouring out the story of her awakening with a honesty she had not allowed herself in their brief, cheerful correspondence of the past 2 years. And in writing these truths, Eleanor found them becoming more real, more solid, the narrative of her transformation taking shape in ink and paper until she could see clearly the woman she had been and the woman she was becoming. The Pemberton Ball arrived in early December with all the glittering magnificence that London society expected from one of the season's premier events, and both Duke and Duchess Ashworth were expected to attend, their positions in society making absence impossible, despite the fact that they had not appeared together at a social function in nearly 18 months. Christopher, having developed a pattern of excuses that kept Eleanor home while he fulfilled their obligations alone. Eleanor dressed for the evening with particular care, choosing a gown of deep emerald silk that her modiste had delivered just that week, the color bringing out the richness of her dark hair and the warmth of her complexion in ways that the pale, muted shades she had previously worn had never achieved. And as her maid arranged her hair in an elegant style adorned with pearl combs, Eleanor studied her reflection with a quiet satisfaction that had nothing to do with vanity and everything to do with the simple pleasure of recognizing herself again after 2 years of feeling like a ghost in her own life. Christopher arrived at the ballroom before Eleanor, positioning himself near the refreshment tables where he could observe the gathering without being drawn into extended conversations, and when Eleanor entered some 20 minutes later, he saw her in his peripheral vision, a flash of green among the pastels and whites favored by younger ladies, and though he kept his eyes carefully directed away from her face, he was aware of her movement through the room with an intensity that surprised him, as if some part of his consciousness had been calibrated to track her presence, whether he wished it or not. Eleanor moved through the social landscape with a grace and confidence that would have astonished anyone who had witnessed her shy, hesitant manner in the first year of her marriage, accepting introductions and engaging in conversation with an ease that suggested genuine enjoyment rather than dutiful performance. And when the dancing began, she was immediately claimed by Lord Hastings for a waltz, then by Mr. Pemberton's eldest son for a quadrille, then by a succession of gentlemen whose attention to the Duchess seemed to Christopher, watching from his position against the wall, to be unusually persistent and marked by an admiration that made something hot and uncomfortable twist in his chest. He told himself his irritation stemmed from concern for propriety, that Eleanor's enjoyment of all this male attention reflected poorly on his management of his household, but the explanation felt hollow even to him, failing to account for the way his hands clenched when he saw her laughing at something. Lord Hastings said, or the sharp surge of something that felt dangerously like jealousy when young Pemberton held her hand a moment too long after their dance concluded. Christopher found himself moving closer to where Eleanor stood, surrounded by admirers, close enough to hear her voice as she discussed some point about Italian art with a gentleman he vaguely recognized from his club, and the intelligence and wit in her conversation struck him with unexpected force, as if he were hearing a stranger speak rather than the silent, defeated woman who sat at the opposite end of his dinner table each evening, and he wondered, with a confusion that bordered on anger when she had become this person, this vibrant creature who drew eyes and admiration effortlessly. It was as he stood there, his gaze fixed somewhere near Eleanor's shoulder, that he noticed the bare finger of her left hand as she gestured during conversation, the absence of her wedding ring registering in his consciousness with the force of a physical blow, and though he could not have said why this detail should matter when he had worked so carefully to notice nothing about her, the sight of that naked finger sent a shock through his system that left him breathless and disturbed. Christopher left the ball within the hour, claiming a headache to their hosts, and spent the carriage ride back to Ashworth Manor, staring out at the dark London streets, with his mind churning through questions he had no desire to answer, wondering why Eleanor had removed her ring and when she had done so, what it meant that he had not noticed until now, and most disturbing of all, why the discovery filled him with a panic he could neither name nor understand, as if something he had not known he valued was slipping away while he stood frozen in the prison of his own making. Christopher found himself standing in the east wing of Ashworth Manor on a grey December afternoon, the wing that housed Eleanor's private chambers, and he could not have explained what impulse had drawn him there when he had spent 2 years carefully avoiding this part of the house, structuring his movements to ensure they never coincided with hers. Yet here he stood in the corridor outside her sitting room, with his heart beating uncomfortably fast, and his hands clenched at his sides, as if bracing against some invisible force. The door stood slightly ajar, and through the opening he could see that the room had been transformed since he had last glimpsed it during those early weeks of their marriage, the heavy burgundy drapes replaced with curtains of soft cream that allowed the winter light to fill the space, and everywhere he looked he saw evidence of Eleanor's presence, books stacked on the side table, a shawl draped over the back of a chair, fresh hothouse roses in a crystal vase that filled the air with their delicate scent. He pushed the door open wider, knowing she was out visiting Lady Margaret and would not return for hours, and stepped into what felt like foreign territory, a space that belonged so completely to someone he had refused to know that entering it seemed an act of trespass. Yet he could not stop himself from moving deeper into the room, drawn by a curiosity that felt dangerously like hunger. The paintings stopped him in his tracks, canvases propped against the wall and arranged on a makeshift easel near the window, and Christopher stood before them with something close to shock, for he had not known Eleanor painted, had not known she possessed this talent, had never thought to ask or observe or care about what she might do with the endless hours of solitude he had imposed upon her. The paintings were remarkable, landscapes rendered with a sensitivity to light and shadow that spoke of genuine skill and a keen observational eye, still lifes that captured the quiet beauty of ordinary objects, and there, turned to face the wall as if she had not wished to see it, a portrait that made Christopher's breath catch in his chest when he turned it around. The woman in the portrait sat alone in a window seat, her face turned toward light that streamed through glass, and though Eleanor had not painted her own features with photographic precision, there was no mistaking the subject, the dark hair, the graceful line of her neck, the posture that somehow conveyed both solitude and a strange, hard-won contentment, as if the woman had made peace with her isolation and found in it a kind of freedom. Christopher stared at this painted version of his wife, this woman alone but not broken, and felt the first real stirrings of guilt, the recognition that while he had been carefully not looking at Eleanor, she had been here creating beauty, cultivating an interior life he knew nothing about, existing in dimensions he had never bothered to imagine. He moved to her writing desk, knowing he should not, knowing this was a violation of her privacy, yet unable to stop himself from picking up the book that lay open there, a volume of poetry by Elizabeth Barrett Browning, and he saw that Eleanor had marked certain passages, had written notes in the margins in a small, precise hand, and one annotation in particular arrested him. Love that endures must first survive indifference, but can a heart survive what breaks it? The question hung in Christopher's mind as he set the book down carefully, exactly as he had found it, and he understood with a clarity that felt like waking from a long sleep that he knew nothing about the woman he had married, nothing about her thoughts or dreams or the interior landscape of her heart, and this ignorance was not accidental but deliberate, a choice he had made every day for 2 years, a choice that had cost Eleanor everything and cost him more than he had understood until this moment, when he stood surrounded by the evidence of a life she had built in the spaces his rejection had created. The dinner party Christopher hosted for his business associates in mid-December was an obligation he could not avoid, a gathering of railway investors and their wives who expected the full hospitality of Ashworth Manor, and Eleanor presided over the evening with a grace that would have seemed impossible to anyone who had witnessed her withdrawn, tentative manner in the early months of their marriage, moving through the courses with an effortless charm that kept conversation flowing and guests engaged in ways that made Christopher feel like a stranger in his own home, watching a performance he had no part in creating. She wore a gown of midnight blue that he glimpsed only in his peripheral vision, and her voice carried down the length of the table with a warmth and animation he had never heard from her before, discussing topics that ranged from recent exhibitions at the Royal Academy to debates in Parliament, with an intelligence and wit that drew admiration from every gentleman present, and Christopher found himself listening despite his determination not to, caught by the musical quality of her laughter, when Mr. Thornton made some observation about the absurdity of modern architecture, a laugh that seemed to come from genuine amusement rather than polite obligation, full-throated and unrestrained in a way that made something tighten painfully in his chest. He heard Eleanor engage Mrs. Thornton in a spirited discussion about Italian opera, revealing that she had studied music in her youth and could play both pianoforte and harp. Information that struck Christopher with the force of revelation, for how could he not know these things about his own wife? How could he have lived in the same house with her for 2 years and remained ignorant of these fundamental aspects of her character? And the question disturbed him more than he wished to acknowledge. When dinner concluded and the ladies withdrew to allow the gentlemen their port and cigars, Mr. Hartley, the eldest of Christopher's business partners, raised his glass with a benevolent smile and declared, "You are a fortunate man, Ashworth, to have secured such a duchess. Your wife is a credit to your house, intelligent and gracious in equal measure. We were just remarking that you must count yourself blessed in your marriage." The words hung in the smoke-filled air, and Christopher felt every eye turned toward him, waiting for the expected response, the conventional pleasantries that should have come easily to a man married 2 years, but his throat constricted, and the practiced phrases died unspoken, for how could he claim fortune in a marriage he had deliberately destroyed? How could he speak of blessings when he had treated Eleanor with a cruelty that now seemed monstrous in its sustained deliberation? And his silence stretched too long, became awkward, until he managed only a terse nod and a murmured agreement that satisfied no one, least of all himself. When the gentlemen rejoined the ladies in the drawing-room, Christopher positioned himself near the fireplace where he could observe without participating, and he found his attention drawn inexorably toward Eleanor, despite his best efforts at indifference, his gaze tracking her movements as she sat at the pianoforte at Mrs. Hartley's request, and played with a skill that suggested years of dedicated practice, her bare fingers moving across the keys with confidence and precision. And he almost looked at her face then, almost turned his head, those crucial degrees that would have brought her features into full view, almost allowed himself to see what he had forbidden himself to acknowledge, but old habits held firm, and he wrenched his gaze away, though the effort cost him more than he could have imagined, leaving him shaken and hollowed out by the loss of something he could not name. After the guests departed and the house settled into silence, Christopher found himself standing outside Eleanor's chambers in the darkened corridor, his hand raised to knock, words forming and dissolving in his mind as he tried to find some way to bridge the chasm he had created, but courage failed him, and he stood there like a fool until he heard movement beyond the door, Eleanor's footsteps and the sound of her preparing for bed, and he retreated to his own rooms with the bitter knowledge that he had become a coward, afraid to face the consequences of his own deliberate blindness, afraid most of all that if he finally looked at Eleanor, truly looked at her, he would have to acknowledge everything he had destroyed and everything he might have had if he had chosen differently 2 years ago, when his father's death had forced him into a marriage he had not wanted and punished Eleanor for a crime she had never committed. Eleanor's announcement came at breakfast 3 days after the dinner party, delivered in the same composed tone she might have used to comment on the weather, informing Christopher that she had accepted her sister's long-standing invitation to visit the family estate in Derbyshire and would be departing within the week for a fortnight's stay, the first time she would leave Ashworth Manor since their wedding 2 years prior. And Christopher felt something lurch in his chest at the news, though he could not have named the emotion, could not understand why the prospect of Eleanor's absence should affect him when he had spent every day of their marriage ensuring they remained as separate as two people sharing a house could be. He opened his mouth to object, to say something that might delay or prevent her departure, but the words died unformed, because what right did he have to protest What claim could he possibly make on her time or presence when he had treated her as if she did not exist? And so he merely nodded and returned his attention to his newspaper, while Eleanor continued speaking about travel arrangements and household matters in that same calm, distant voice that suggested she was discussing plans with a business associate rather than her husband. The days before her departure passed with an efficiency that troubled Christopher more than he wished to acknowledge, Eleanor moving through the manor with quiet purpose, as her lady's maid packed trunks and coordinated with the housekeeper about what would be needed during the Duchess's absence. And Christopher found himself tracking these preparations from a distance, standing at windows that overlooked the courtyard where servants loaded her belongings, lingering in corridors where he might glimpse her passing, though he maintained his careful practice of never looking directly at her, even as something in him strained toward her with an urgency that felt dangerously close to panic. On the morning of Eleanor's departure, Christopher positioned himself in his study, where the window provided a clear view of the entrance, and he watched as she emerged in a traveling dress of deep green, her posture straight and her movements unhurried. And he noticed how she paused to speak with Mrs. Hartwell, the housekeeper, with what appeared to be genuine warmth, how she smiled at something one of the footmen said as he handed her into the carriage, how she settled into her seat and gazed up at the manor's facade with an expression he could not read from this distance, but that seemed to contain neither regret nor longing, only a kind of peaceful resolution. The carriage rolled down the long drive and disappeared beyond the gates, and Christopher remained at the window long after it had gone, gripped by a sense of loss so acute it took his breath away, and the manor seemed to shift around him in Eleanor's absence, the silence taking on a different quality, heavier and more complete, as if her departure had removed something essential from the house's atmosphere, some vital presence he had never consciously registered, but whose absence left everything hollow and strange. He moved through the rest of the day in a state of distraction he could not shake, finding himself standing in doorways, wondering what he had meant to do there, picking up books and setting them down unread, and when evening came and he sat alone at the long dining table, where just days before Eleanor had presided over their guests with such grace and wit, her empty chair seemed to consume all his attention, an absence more powerful than any presence. And Christopher understood with a clarity that felt like falling that the manor had not been his home for these past months. It had been Eleanor's, that she had filled it with life and light. He had been too deliberately blind to see. And now that she was gone, he was left in a house that felt less like a residence and more like a mausoleum, empty and cold and utterly devoid of the warmth he had not known he was missing until it disappeared. The silence of Ashworth Manor in Eleanor's absence was not merely the absence of sound, but something deeper and more unsettling, a stillness that seemed to press against Christopher's consciousness with accusatory weight as he wandered through rooms that suddenly felt unfamiliar despite his having lived in them all his life, and he found himself gravitating toward the spaces Eleanor had claimed as her own. The morning room where she took her tea, the small library where she read in the afternoons, the music room where he now realized she must have practiced the pianoforte that had so impressed his dinner guests, each space bearing traces of her presence that he had never consciously registered, but that now seemed painfully obvious in their accumulated detail. He stood in the doorway of the conservatory where winter light filtered through glass panes onto the small writing desk Eleanor had positioned near the windows, and he saw her correspondence laid out with characteristic neatness, letters to her sister and to Lady Margaret, and to various charitable organizations, and he understood with a shock of recognition that she had built an entire life within these walls, a life he had known nothing about because he had deliberately chosen ignorance, had constructed his whole existence around not seeing her, not acknowledging her, not allowing her to become real to him in any way that might have demanded his attention or his care. When dinner time arrived that first evening, Christopher sat alone at the long mahogany table where Eleanor's empty chair seemed to draw his gaze with magnetic insistence, and he found he could not eat, could not focus on the food before him or the newspaper he had brought as distraction, because all he could think about was how Eleanor had sat there night after night for 2 years, enduring his deliberate discourtesy, his reading and his silence and his absolute refusal to acknowledge her presence, and the cruelty of it settled over him like a physical weight that made breathing difficult. In desperation, he sought refuge in Eleanor's book, a volume of poetry by Elizabeth Barrett Browning that she had left on the side table in the drawing room, and he opened it to find her annotations in the margins, careful notes written in her precise hand that revealed a thoughtful, searching intelligence, observations about meter and meaning and emotional truth that spoke of a woman who engaged deeply with ideas and art. And Christopher read her words with growing wonder and growing shame, for how had he shared a house with this person and never known her, never even attempted to know her, never once considered that she might be someone worth knowing rather than simply an obligation to be endured. On the third day of Eleanor's absence, a letter arrived addressed to him in an unfamiliar hand, and when Christopher broke the seal, he found it was from Eleanor's sister, Lady Caroline Pemberton, thanking him with what seemed like genuine warmth for allowing Eleanor the freedom to visit, for being understanding of her need for time away from her duties, for being the kind of husband who recognized that even a duchess required respite and family connection. And every word struck Christopher like a physical blow, because the letter assumed a generosity and consideration he had never shown, painted him as a thoughtful partner, when the truth was that Eleanor had not asked his permission because she had understood with perfect clarity that she did not need it, that their marriage was so hollow and so devoid of genuine connection that her movements were her own affair and his opinion irrelevant. The phrase haunted him through sleepless nights and distracted days, that word allowing, as if Eleanor were a possession whose activities required his approval rather than a person with her own agency and her own desires. And Christopher was forced to confront the uncomfortable truth that he had indeed treated her exactly that way, had viewed her as an inconvenient addition to his household rather than as his wife, had given her the title and the position and the material comforts of being Duchess of Ashworth, while denying her the one thing that might have made any of it meaningful, which was simple human recognition, a basic acknowledgement of her existence and her worth. He sat in his study as winter darkness fell early over the grounds, and for the first time in 2 years Christopher allowed himself to think consciously about Eleanor, not as an abstract problem or an unwanted obligation, but as a person, a woman who had entered his house with hope and had been met with systematic cruelty, who had tried to build bridges and had been rebuffed at every turn, who had finally stopped trying and had found her own path forward, and the thought that formed in his mind was simple and devastating and impossible to dismiss. What have I done? On the 7th morning of Eleanor's absence, Christopher found himself walking through the Winterbear Gardens toward the family chapel that stood at the edge of the estate grounds, a small stone building where generations of Ashworths had been baptized and married and mourned, and where a memorial plaque for Lady Victoria Hartley bore witness to the woman whose death had defined the last 3 years of his life. And he had not visited this place since the week after Victoria's passing, and had avoided it with the same deliberate care he had applied to avoiding Eleanor, but now he felt drawn there by a need he could not fully articulate, a sense that some essential reckoning awaited him in that quiet, sacred space. The chapel was cold and dim, winter light filtering through stained glass windows to paint colored shadows across worn stone floors, and Christopher stood before Victoria's memorial with his hands clasped behind his back, studying the inscription he had commissioned in his grief, the words that spoke of beauty and grace and love eternal, and he waited for the familiar wave of sorrow to crash over him, the devastating sense of loss that had consumed him in the months after her death. But what came instead was something quieter and more complicated, a sadness certainly, but also a strange kind of distance, as if he were looking at a memorial for someone he had known long ago rather than the woman he had believed himself destined to marry. He spoke aloud to the empty chapel, his voice rough with disuse and emotion, telling Victoria things he had never said when she lived, admitting that he had made her into something she had never been, had transformed a genuine affection into a grand romantic tragedy, because grief was easier than acceptance, because mourning an idealized love was simpler than building a real one with the flesh and blood woman who had become his wife. And as the words spilled from him, Christopher understood with devastating clarity that he had been punishing Eleanor, not for failing to be Victoria, but for being real, for being present, for demanding through her very existence that he engage with life rather than retreat into the comfortable fiction of eternal mourning. The realization settled over him like winter frost, cold and inescapable, and Christopher sank onto one of the wooden pews and dropped his head into his hands, finally allowing himself to see the full scope of his cruelty. The systematic way he had denied Eleanor every basic human courtesy, had treated her not merely with indifference, but with active contempt, refusing to look at her as if she was something shameful or grotesque, when the truth was that his refusal had nothing to do with Eleanor herself, and everything to do with his own cowardice, his fear that if he allowed himself to see her, he might have to acknowledge that Victoria was truly gone, and that life continued despite his grief, and that he had married a woman who deserved better than to be a ghost in her own home. He sat in the silence of the chapel as shadows lengthened, and the afternoon wore on, and Christopher made a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable, acknowledging to himself and to the memory of Victoria that it was time to let her rest. Time to stop using her death as an excuse for his own emotional abdication. Time to try, however imperfectly and however late, to be the husband Eleanor deserved, rather than the monument to grief he had become, though he had no idea how to begin, no template for transformation. Only a bone-deep understanding that when Eleanor returned from Derbyshire, he would have to find the courage to do the one thing he had avoided for 2 years, the one thing that terrified him more than any business venture or social obligation ever had, which was to simply look at his wife, to see her, to allow her to be real to him in all her complexity and humanity. And he practiced there in the empty chapel, lifting his head and trying to imagine Eleanor's face, realizing with shame that he could not clearly picture her features because he had so carefully avoided ever truly seeing them, and the prospect of meeting her gaze felt like preparing to leap from a great height into unknown waters, terrifying and necessary and long overdue. Eleanor's carriage arrived at Ashworth Manor on a crystalline afternoon when winter sunlight made the frost-covered grounds glitter like scattered diamonds, and as the wheels crunched over the gravel drive, she felt a curious mixture of emotions. Relief at returning to familiar spaces mingled with a subtle reluctance to re-enter the cold architecture of her marriage, though she reminded herself that the marriage had changed for her, even if it remained unchanged for Christopher, that she had found her own peace and her own purpose, and no longer needed his acknowledgement to feel whole. And as the footman handed her down from the carriage, Eleanor held her head high and her shoulders back, wearing the confidence she had cultivated during her fortnight away like invisible armor. What she did not expect was to find Christopher standing in the entrance hall, not sequestered in his study as he invariably was during her comings and goings, and the sight of him waiting there stopped Eleanor momentarily in the doorway, her careful composure faltering for just an instant before she recovered and moved forward with measured grace, and she saw him shift his weight slightly as she approached, saw something that might have been nervousness in the set of his shoulders, and when he attempted to look at her, she watched his gaze travel upward from the marble floor to the hem of her traveling dress to her waist, and then falter, skittering sideways to fix on some point beyond her shoulder, and Eleanor felt a flash of something that might have been disappointment or might have been vindication, for even now, even after 2 weeks of absence, he could not manage the simple human courtesy of meeting her eyes. Christopher's voice when he spoke was rougher than she remembered, lower somehow, as if disuse had changed its timbre, and he said, "Welcome home, Eleanor," using her given name for what she realized might be the first time since their wedding day, and the sound of it in his mouth was so unexpected that Eleanor felt her prepared coolness waver slightly, but she steadied herself and replied with perfect formality, "Thank you, Your Grace." The journey was pleasant, keeping her tone neutral and polite, the voice one might use with a distant acquaintance rather than a husband. She watched his hands clench and unclench at his sides, watched his gaze drift downward to her hands, where she held her gloves and reticule, and she saw the exact moment when his eyes fixed on her left hand, saw his whole body go still as he registered the absence of her wedding ring, the bare fourth finger with its pale band of skin that remained as evidence of what had been worn there for 2 years, and Eleanor felt a perverse satisfaction at his reaction, even as something in her chest tightened at the visible shock that crossed his features, the way his breathing seemed to catch, and his jaw tightened as if he were experiencing physical pain. The silence stretched between them in the grand entrance hall, while servants moved discreetly around them carrying her luggage, and Eleanor waited with the patience she had learned through 2 years of being ignored, wondering if Christopher would speak again, or if this unprecedented attempt at welcome had exhausted his capacity for engagement, and when he finally managed to form words, they came out halting and uncertain. "Did you have a pleasant visit with your sister?" Cole, and Eleanor responded with cool civility about Caroline's health and spirits and the amusements of Derbyshire society, answering his question thoroughly while offering nothing of her inner experience, nothing of how the visit had strengthened her resolve or deepened her understanding of her own worth. And as she spoke, she watched Christopher's continued inability to look at her directly, watched him struggle with something she could not name, and when she finished speaking, she excused herself with flawless courtesy, saying she needed to rest from the journey, leaving Christopher standing alone in the entrance hall, with his failed attempt at connection hanging in the air between them like smoke. The morning after Eleanor's return, Christopher appeared at the breakfast table for the first time in their marriage, arriving before she did, and waiting with barely concealed nervousness as she entered the room, her composure faltering only slightly at the sight of him, seated there with a cup of tea cooling before him, untouched, and when she took her place at the opposite end of the long table, he cleared his throat and asked, with an awkwardness that was almost painful to witness, whether she had slept well after her journey, and Eleanor responded with careful courtesy that she had, "Thank you," her tone suggesting she was speaking to an acquaintance rather than a husband, and Christopher felt the distance between them like a physical thing, a chasm he had spent 2 years excavating and now found himself desperate to cross, though he had no idea how to begin building a bridge. Over the following days he continued appearing at breakfast, asking questions about her painting with genuine if fumbling interest, and Eleanor answered with guarded politeness, clearly confused by this sudden attention, her responses thorough but revealing nothing of her inner thoughts, and Christopher found himself frustrated by his own limitations, by the way his eyes still skittered away from her face whenever he tried to look directly at her, decades of habit proving impossible to break in mere days, and he would sit across from her feeling like a man trapped behind glass, able to see the shape of what he wanted, but unable to reach it. He began leaving small gestures of apology and interest, scattered through her days like breadcrumbs, commissioning fresh flowers to be placed in her studio each morning, lilies and winter roses that filled the space with subtle fragrance, and having his secretary acquire books he thought might interest her based on the volumes he had seen in her chambers, poetry and philosophy, and novels by lady authors, items he left on her desk without explanation, and he requested her presence at dinner, not through servants but by asking her himself, appearing at her studio door in the late afternoon and speaking to the frame rather than to her, saying he would be honored if she would join him for the evening meal, and Eleanor agreed each time with formal graciousness, her acceptance feeling more like an obligation discharged than a desire fulfilled. At these dinners, Christopher attempted conversation, asking about her sister's family and her charitable work and the paintings she was creating, and Eleanor responded with the same careful politeness she had shown since her return, her words correct and her manner impeccable, but her true self held carefully beyond his reach, and Christopher understood with growing desperation that he had taught her too well to be invisible, had spent 2 years training her not to expect anything from him, and now his fumbling attempts at connection must seem either incomprehensible or suspect, possibly even cruel in their own way, like a cat playing with a mouse it has already wounded. He found himself thinking about her constantly, this woman he had ignored so thoroughly, wondering what thoughts moved behind her careful expression, what dreams she harbored, what she felt when she looked at him now, with those cool, measuring eyes that saw him clearly, even though he still could not bring himself to meet them. And the irony was not lost on Christopher, that for 2 years, Eleanor had been desperate for his attention while he withheld it, and now he craved her regard while she offered him only polite disinterest, and he recognized this reversal as a justice he had earned, but that did not make it any easier to bear, did not ease the growing ache in his chest every time she thanked him formally for the flowers or the books, her gratitude perfectly executed and completely devoid of warmth, the gratitude one offers a stranger for holding open a door rather than a husband attempting to repair a shattered marriage. The confrontation came on a grey afternoon when sleet tapped against the windows of Eleanor's studio, and she had been attempting to paint for an hour without success, her mind too restless to focus on canvas and colour, too occupied with the strange metamorphosis occurring in her marriage, and when Christopher appeared in her doorway bearing yet another offering, this time a leather-bound volume of Elizabeth Barrett Browning's sonnets. Eleanor set down her brush with deliberate care and turned to face him directly, her voice steady and clear when she said, "Christopher, we need to speak plainly about what is happening here." And she watched him freeze in the doorway, watched his gaze fix on the painting behind her rather than on her face, and the familiar avoidance ignited something fierce in her chest, something that had been building through weeks of flowers and books and awkward breakfast conversations that never quite connected. She asked him directly why he was doing this, why, after 2 years of studied indifference, he was suddenly appearing at her breakfast table and filling her studio with flowers and seeking her company at dinner. And Christopher's response came haltingly, his words stumbling over each other as he tried to explain that he had been wrong, that he had realized during her absence how thoroughly he had failed her, that he wanted to try to be a proper husband. And Eleanor listened with her hands folded before her, those bare hands with her ring finger still showing its pale band of absence. And when he finished speaking, she said with quiet dignity, "You cannot even look at me while you say these things." The words hung in the air between them like an accusation and a plea, and Eleanor watched Christopher flinch as if she had struck him, watched him try and fail again, to raise his eyes to her face, and she felt a dangerous mixture of anger and sorrow rise in her throat as she began to speak about the 2 years of invisibility, about sitting across from him at dinner tables, feeling less substantial than the furniture, about speaking to him and receiving grunts or silence in return, about slowly disappearing in her own home until she was little more than a ghost haunting the corridors of Ashworth Manor. She told him about the nights she had lain awake, wondering what was wrong with her that her own husband could not bear to look at her, about the gradual erosion of her self-worth, about the careful reconstruction of her dignity that had required her to stop seeking his approval and start seeking her own. And Christopher stood motionless in the doorway, listening to this litany of his cruelties with his jaw tight and his hands clenched at his sides. And when she paused, he said, his voice rough with shame, "I am sorry, Eleanor. I am deeply, profoundly sorry for the pain I have caused you." But Eleanor shook her head slowly and replied that apologies were not enough, that she would not accept half measures or symbolic gestures, that if he truly wanted to repair what he had broken, he needed to actually change, and not just perform change while maintaining the same careful distance he had always kept. She told him then about removing her wedding ring, about the morning she had slipped it off her finger and placed it in her jewelry box, about what that act had meant, the reclamation of herself from a marriage that had never truly acknowledged her existence. And she saw Christopher's eyes drop again to her bare hand, saw something that looked like anguish cross his features, and she said softly but firmly that she would not put that ring back on for gestures and pleasantries, that she deserved a husband who could look at her, who could see her, who could acknowledge her as a living, breathing person rather than an inconvenient reminder of duty. And if he could not offer her that, then she would prefer he return to his previous indifference rather than torment them both with this awkward pretense of connection. That evening, Christopher found himself walking through the manor with no destination in mind, his feet carrying him through corridors and down staircases until he emerged into the garden, where twilight was surrendering to full darkness, and the air held that electric quality that precedes a storm, and he saw Eleanor standing near the fountain, with her shawl drawn tight against the rising wind, her face turned upward toward the roiling clouds, and something in Christopher's chest cracked open like ice breaking in spring thaw, some final resistance shattering under the accumulated weight of his loneliness and shame and desperate longing, and he walked toward her without conscious decision, his feet moving across the gravel path, while thunder rumbled in the distance and the first fat drops of rain began to fall. He stopped 3 paces from her, close enough to see the way the wind caught strands of her dark hair and pulled them free from their pins, close enough to hear her breath, and Eleanor turned toward him with surprise written across her features, and Christopher felt his heart hammering against his ribs as he forced himself, truly forced himself with every ounce of will he possessed, to raise his eyes from the ground and look at her face, to actually look at his wife's face for the first time in their 2 years of marriage. And the world seemed to tilt and realign as his gaze met hers. She had grey eyes, he discovered, grey eyes with flecks of blue like storm clouds shot through with lightning, and they were looking back at him with a mixture of wariness and shock, and something he could not quite name, and her face was not the face he had imagined in the rare moments when he had allowed himself to think about her features. It was better and more complex and more beautiful, with high cheekbones and a mouth that held both strength and softness, and there was intelligence in those eyes, and pain, and a hard-won dignity that he had forged through his neglect, and Christopher felt the full weight of 2 years of blindness crash over him like a wave, felt the enormity of what he had refused to see, this remarkable woman who had lived in his house like a ghost because he had made her one. Eleanor stood perfectly still under his gaze, rain falling harder now and soaking through both their clothes, and Christopher saw her throat work as she swallowed, saw vulnerability flash across her features before she could mask it, and he understood that this moment was costing her something, that allowing herself to be truly seen by him after so long required a courage he was not sure he possessed, and the knowledge of her bravery unmanned him completely. He said, his voice rough and breaking, "Eleanor, I see you. God help me. I finally see you, and you are extraordinary." And the words came pouring out of him without elegance or planning, a raw confession that he had been a coward and a fool, and that he had hidden from her, because looking at her would have required him to acknowledge that Victoria was truly gone, and that he had a living, breathing wife who deserved his attention and his respect and his heart, and that he had been cruel beyond measure, and that cruelty had been deliberate, a choice he had made every day for 2 years, and he could not undo it. But he wanted desperately to do better, to be better, if she would give him the chance. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears that mingled with the rain on her cheeks, and Christopher felt his hands rise of their own accord, hovering near her face with the desperate desire to comfort her, to touch her, but he held himself back because he had not earned that right, had forfeited it through his systematic rejection of her presence. And Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm, "You are looking at me." And Christopher nodded, unable to look away now, unable to imagine ever looking away again. And he said, "I am looking at you, and I am sorry. I am so deeply sorry for every moment I refused to do so." And Eleanor reached up slowly and caught one of his hovering hands in both of hers, and the touch was like lightning, electric and transformative, and they stood there in the garden while the storm broke fully overhead and thunder shook the earth beneath their feet, looking at each other with rain streaming down their faces, and 2 years of silence finally giving way to the possibility of something real. The rebuilding of their marriage came slowly, like spring emerging from the hard ground of winter, measured not in grand gestures, but in accumulated moments of genuine connection that Christopher approached with the careful reverence of a man handling something infinitely precious and infinitely fragile. And the weeks following that storm-drenched revelation in the garden unfolded with a tentative sweetness that neither of them had imagined possible in the cold corridors of Ashworth Manor. Christopher began joining Eleanor for breakfast each morning, and these meals transformed from the silent ordeals of their first 2 years into conversations where he asked her about her painting and listened with genuine attention when she described the way light fell through the studio windows at different hours, the way certain colors evoked specific emotions, the technical challenges of capturing movement on a static canvas, and Eleanor found herself speaking with growing ease, her initial wariness softening as she recognized that Christopher was truly listening, truly seeing her, his gray eyes meeting hers across the table with a directness that still sometimes made her breath catch after so long being invisible. He asked if he might watch her paint one afternoon, and Eleanor agreed with some trepidation, uncertain how she would feel creating under his observation. But Christopher settled onto the window seat in her studio, with his own sketchbook and charcoal, confessing that he had once enjoyed drawing before duty and grief had consumed all leisure, and they worked in companionable silence, broken only by occasional questions about technique or requests to pass supplies. And when Eleanor glanced over at Christopher's sketch, she saw he had been drawing her, capturing the concentration in her features as she worked, and the intimacy of being seen and rendered by his hand brought color to her cheeks and warmth to her chest. They took walks through the estate grounds as winter surrendered to early spring, and Christopher pointed out landmarks and shared stories of his childhood that he had never thought to tell her before, and Eleanor reciprocated with tales of her own upbringing. And gradually they began to know each other as people rather than as the Duke and Duchess, as Christopher and Eleanor rather than as husband and the woman who was not Victoria. And there were moments when their hands brushed while walking and neither pulled away, moments when Christopher's laugh rang out genuine and surprised at something Eleanor said. Moments when the weight of their painful history seemed to lighten under the accumulation of these better moments. The ring remained off Eleanor's finger, sitting in its velvet box in her jewelry chest, and neither of them mentioned it, though Christopher's eyes sometimes lingered on that bare finger with an expression Eleanor could not quite read. Something between regret and hope, and the absence of the ring became a marker of their progress, a reminder that what they were building now was new and earned rather than assumed and obligated. And Eleanor found that she preferred it this way, preferred the freedom of choosing Christopher daily rather than being bound by a symbol she had worn without meaning. Their first kiss came on an evening 6 weeks after the garden confrontation, when they had been reading together in the library, and Christopher had made some observation about the novel Eleanor held that was so perfectly attuned to her own thoughts that she looked up at him with surprise and delight, and he was already looking at her with such open affection that the space between them seemed to evaporate. And when he leaned toward her slowly, giving her every opportunity to retreat, Eleanor met him halfway, and the kiss was soft and questioning and achingly tender, a question and an answer, a promise and a hope, and when they drew apart, Eleanor saw tears standing in Christopher's eyes and felt answering wetness on her own cheeks, and Christopher whispered, "Thank you for giving me another chance, for letting me learn to love you properly." And Eleanor touched his face gently and replied, "Thank you for finally choosing to see me." And the intimacy between them deepened from that night forward, not rushed but unfolding with patient inevitability, two people truly discovering each other for the first time and finding in that discovery something far richer than either had anticipated. Spring arrived at Ashworth Manor exactly 1 year after Eleanor had removed her wedding ring, and the transformation was evident, not merely in the blossoms that covered the garden trees, or the warmth that had returned to the ancient stone halls, but in the way Christopher and Eleanor moved through their days with the easy intimacy of two people who had chosen each other deliberately and completely, building something real from the ashes of their hollow beginning. And on a morning when sunlight streamed through the breakfast room windows and Eleanor was laughing at something Christopher had said about the new foal in the stables, he reached into his waistcoat pocket and withdrew a small velvet box that made Eleanor's breath catch in her throat. The ring inside was nothing like the cold family heirloom she had worn during those terrible first years, but rather a delicate band commissioned from London's finest jeweler, designed to Christopher's exact specifications, with Eleanor's favorite flowers engraved along its surface, and a single perfect sapphire, the color of storm clouds shot through with lightning, the color of her eyes when she had first allowed him to truly see her in that rain-soaked garden. And Christopher said quietly, as he held it out to her, "I cannot undo the years I wasted, is the pain I caused you, but I can offer you this as a symbol of the man I am now, rather than the man I was. A promise that I see you every day and choose you every day, and will continue to do so for all our remaining days, if you will accept it, if you will accept me as your husband in truth, rather than merely in name." Eleanor looked at the ring with tears gathering in her eyes, then at Christopher's face where love and hope and lingering remorse were written so clearly, and she reached out not to take the ring from his hand, but to cover his hand with both of hers, and she said, "I will accept it gladly, but I will place it on my own finger this time, because what we have now is not something imposed upon us by duty or arrangement, but something we have built together through honesty and patience and the courage to truly see one another." And she took the ring and slid it onto her finger where it caught the morning light and seemed to glow with warmth. And Christopher rose from his chair and drew her into his arms and kissed her with the tender devotion that had become their daily language, and neither of them noticed the servants who paused in the doorway and smiled at the sight of their Duke and Duchess so clearly, so genuinely happy. Years passed after that spring morning, years that brought children whose laughter filled the corridors that had once echoed with Eleanor's lonely footsteps, children who grew up watching their father look at their mother with such obvious adoration that they never questioned whether they had been loved from the very beginning, and Christopher became known throughout society, not for his tragic first love, but for his devotion to his Duchess, attending her art exhibitions and insisting that her work hang in the manor's finest rooms, and speaking of her with such pride that no one who heard him could doubt the depth of his feeling, and Eleanor bloomed in the warmth of being truly seen and truly cherished, her confidence and joy radiating outward to touch everyone in their household and beyond. and Ashworth Manor transformed from a mausoleum of grief into a home filled with love and light and the sound of genuine happiness. Dear listener, in Eleanor and Christopher's story we find a truth that perhaps you needed to hear today, that sometimes the cruelest prisons are the ones we build for ourselves from grief and fear and the refusal to be present in our own lives, and sometimes the bravest act is not enduring mistreatment with silent dignity, but claiming your own worth and stepping away from what diminishes you, as Eleanor did when she removed that ring and chose herself. Yet we also see that transformation is possible even for those who have caused great harm, that the willingness to truly see another person, to acknowledge one's cruelty and commit to change, and can open pathways to redemption that seemed forever closed, though such redemption must be earned through consistent action rather than mere words or wishes. If you find yourself invisible in your own life, if you have been patient beyond reason while receiving nothing in return, know that you deserve to be seen and valued, and that choosing yourself is not selfishness, but necessary preservation of your soul, and that the absence of your presence may be the very thing that awakens someone to what they have been too blind to recognize, though you owe them nothing, and their awakening may come too late. And if you are the one who has failed to see what was before you, who has hidden from love out of fear or grief or the weight of past sorrows, know that while you cannot undo the harm you have caused, you can choose differently from this moment forward. You can do the difficult work of being truly present and truly seeing, and that such work, sustained with genuine commitment, can create something beautiful from even the most painful beginnings. May you find the courage to be seen and the wisdom to truly see. May you choose yourself when necessary and choose love when possible. May you build relationships founded on genuine recognition rather than obligation or illusion. And may you rest tonight, knowing that transformation is always possible for those willing to do the honest work of change. This has been a story from Love's Second Chances, and if these words have touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel and share this story with someone who needs to hear that they deserve to be seen.